That was the transmission broadcast at 0412 hours on November the 17th. It was intercepted by a NATO signal intelligence aircraft loitering 30,000 feet above the Karkaroff Valley, a desolate scar of granite and permafrost in the contested borderlands of Eastern Europe. The audio file, formally classified under the designation Echo 7 Delta, remains one of the most heavily analyzed pieces of acoustic data in modern military doctrine. The voice on the transmission belonged to Viktor Arasov, the operational commander of a heavily mechanized private military corporation. His voice carried no heat, no tremor of ego. He spoke with the flat, measured cadence of an accountant reading a final ledger. He keyed his radio to the defender's primary frequency, a calculated psychological strike intended to break their resolve before the first shot. "Major Vance," Arasov said, "we have established full perimeter containment. We have disabled your primary and secondary extraction routes. I have 400 effectives in staggered assault formations. You have 40 men. We outnumber you 10 to 1. The mathematics are final. Surrender the facility, and you will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Resist, and you will be erased." There was a pause on the recording. In the circling aircraft, the signal analysts leaned into their headsets, waiting for the inevitable sound of a desperate man pleading for air support that did not exist. They waited for the sound of panic. Instead, they recorded 3 seconds of static, followed by a voice with the casual inflection of a man ordering a cup of coffee. 10 to 1, Major Thomas Vance replied. "Then it'll be quick." The transmission ended. To the untrained ear, Vance's response sounded like the bravado of a doomed man. It sounded like a cinematic cliché, a final act of defiance from a soldier who had accepted his own death. But to the military historians and logistical architects who studied the Karkaroff Valley incident years later, that 5-word response was understood for what it truly was. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was a mathematical calculation. Vance was not saying that his death would be quick. He was stating, with absolute clinical certainty, that it would not take him long to process 400 men through the architectural meat grinder he had spent the last 72 hours constructing. He had looked at the number 400, run it through the calculus of his defensive perimeter, and determined the exact duration of the enemy's operational lifespan. On paper, the position had no business still standing. Standard military doctrine dictates that an attacking force requires a 3 to 1 numerical advantage to successfully assault a fortified defensive position. 5 to 1 guarantees victory with moderate casualties. 10 to 1 is not considered a battle. It is classified as an overwhelming kinetic event. It is an avalanche. Arasov knew this. He was a rational actor, a man who built his career on the precise application of overwhelming mass. He did not gamble. He executed formulas. But Arasov made a singular, fatal error in his calculations. He assumed that mass dictated the outcome of friction. He assumed that 400 men possessed 10 times the combat effectiveness of 40 men. He failed to factor in the variable of absolute hypercompetent stoicism. He failed to understand that against a perfectly calibrated defense, numbers cease to be an asset. They become a liability. They become a logistical bottleneck. The mathematics were indeed simple. But Arasov was solving for the wrong equation. To understand the calculus of the Karkaroff Valley, one must first examine the operational architecture of Major Thomas Vance. His personnel file, heavily redacted and buried deep within the Ministry of Defense's archives in London, does not read like the biography of a hero. It reads like the operating manual for a highly specialized piece of industrial machinery. Vance was a 22-year veteran of the Special Air Service. He did not possess the physical silhouette of an action star. He was of average height, lean, and entirely unremarkable in a crowd. His psychological evaluations, conducted annually by the regiment's psychiatrists, consistently noted a singular, defining trait: a complete absence of operational anxiety. Fear is a biological response to the unknown. The human brain panics when it cannot predict the outcome of a situation. Vance did not experience fear because he did not allow for the unknown. He was a practitioner of tactical determinism. During his deployments in the urban sprawl of Baghdad, the high-altitude ridges of the Hindu Kush, and the dense canopies of sub-Saharan Africa, Vance developed a reputation not for aggressive assaults, but for defensive geometry. He was a master of the choke point. He viewed warfare not as a clash of wills, but as a problem of fluid dynamics. Enemy infantry was simply a liquid. If you let it flow over open ground, it would spread out and overwhelm you. But if you built a funnel, if you manipulated the terrain, the sightlines, and the obstacles, you could force that liquid into a space so narrow that its own pressure would tear it apart. When Vance was selected to command the 40-man detachment assigned to the Kharkiv Valley, he did not choose his personnel based on their marksmanship scores alone. Marksmanship is a baseline requirement in the SAS. It is the expected minimum. Instead, Vance selected his team based on their secondary proficiencies. He brought structural engineers. He brought meteorologists who understood the thermal drafts of mountain valleys. He brought acoustics experts who knew how sound waves traveled through granite canyons. He selected men who shared his psychological baseline, the quiet professionals, men who did not require motivational speeches, men who understood that survival wasn't a matter of hope, but a matter of strict adherence to operational doctrine. Upon arriving at the valley, Vance did not gather his men to speak of duty or honor. He gathered them around a topographical map. "We are 40, Vance had said, his voice flat. "The hostile force is estimated at 400. That is a 100% discrepancy. Therefore, we will not fight them simultaneously. We will fight them 4 at a time, 100 times in a row." This is the essence of tactical hypercompetence. It is the reduction of a massive, terrifying threat into a series of small, manageable, mathematical equations. Vance understood that an army of 400 men only matters if all 400 men can point their rifles at you at the same time. If the terrain only allows 4 men to round a corner at any given second, the remaining 396 men are mathematically irrelevant. They are not combatants. They are simply waiting in a queue. For 72 hours before the arrival of Arasov's forces, Vance and his 40 specialists did not sleep. They did not dig standard trenches. Trenches are static. Trenches are targets for mortar fire. Instead, they altered the geography of the valley. They established interlocking fields of fire that overlapped with millimeter precision. They mapped every rock, every depression, and every shadow. They calculated the exact time the sun would crest the eastern ridge and blind an advancing force. They measured the wind speed and its effect on a 7.62 millimeter projectile at a distance of 800 meters. They did not build a fortress. They built an algorithm. And as the sun set on November 16th, painting the granite walls of the valley in deep, cold shadows, the algorithm was complete. The 40 men took their positions. They checked their watches. They calibrated their optics. The cold did not penetrate their focus. Dread found no purchase against their preparation. They only felt the cold, hard certainty of the mathematics they had engineered. The Kharkiv Valley is not a place of natural beauty. It is a jagged, unforgiving tear in the earth, measuring exactly 1.2 miles in length and narrowing to a width of merely 50 yards at its center. To the layman, it is a geographical anomaly. To a tactician, it is a fatal funnel. So why would 400 heavily armed mercenaries risk their lives to capture a desolate rock formation in the middle of nowhere? To understand the battle, one must understand the economy of the conflict. Wars are not fought over dirt. They are fought over infrastructure. Buried 300 feet beneath the permafrost of the Karkaroff Valley, encased in reinforced concrete and lead shielding, was the Archangel Node. It was a subterranean data relay center, built during the twilight of the Cold War and recently retrofitted by NATO intelligence. The Archangel Node was the regional drone network's central nervous system. Reconnaissance flights, automated supply drops. Every encrypted satellite burst within 1,000 miles routed through the servers humming beneath the permafrost. If the enemy captured the Archangel Node, they would gain far more than a piece of territory. They would blind the entire Allied theater of operations. They would sever the digital spine of the Western military apparatus. The strategic value of the valley was incalculable. It was the center of gravity for the entire war. Viktor Arasov knew this. His employers had offered him a sum of money that defied comprehension to secure the valley. Arasov was a logistical architect. He did not take contracts he could not fulfill. He had spent weeks analyzing the Archangel Node. He had studied the satellite imagery. He had reviewed the blueprints of the subterranean facility. He knew that the valley was a choke point. He knew it was a dangerous place to maneuver a large force. But Arasov believed in the absolute supremacy of mass and momentum. His force was not a ragtag militia. It was a highly organized, heavily mechanized private army. He brought armored personnel carriers equipped with 30mm autocannons. He brought mobile mortar teams capable of dropping high-explosive shells with GPS-guided precision. He brought electronic warfare specialists equipped with jamming arrays designed to blind the defenders. Arasov had calculated the logistical requirements of his assault down to the liter of diesel fuel and the number of bandages required for anticipated casualties. He operated on a strict doctrine of attrition. He knew that 40 men, no matter how elite, possessed a finite amount of ammunition. He had done the math. 40 men, firing at a sustained rate to repel an assault, would exhaust their primary ammunition supply in exactly 4.2 hours. Even if they maintained perfect fire discipline, they would run dry before sunrise. Arasov's plan was brutally simple. He would use his numbers to force the SAS detachment into a sustained high-intensity firefight. He would feed his men into the valley in continuous, overlapping waves. He would not give the defenders a moment to breathe, to reload, or to communicate. He would drown them in kinetic pressure. He would spend his men like currency, buying time and depleting the defenders' resources until there was nothing left but empty magazines and exhausted bodies. It was a perfectly rational plan. It was based on established military doctrine. It was the kind of plan that wins wars. But as Arasov's armored convoy rolled to a halt at the mouth of the valley, the heavy diesel engines idling in the freezing air, he made his first observation that did not align with his calculations. The valley was entirely silent. There were no warning shots. There were no visible defensive emplacements. The thermal optics on his armored vehicles registered nothing but the cold ambient temperature of the granite walls. It was as if the valley was empty. Arasov narrowed his eyes, staring at the digital feed on his command screen. He checked the radio intercept data. He knew they were there. He picked up the microphone to deliver his final ultimatum, the transmission that would be recorded and analyzed for decades. He spoke the words. He stated the 10-to-1 ratio. And when Major Vance's voice crackled back through the speaker, calm and devoid of inflection, a tiny, almost imperceptible variable entered Arasov's pristine equation. Doubt. 2,000 miles away in the sterile, fluorescent-lit depths of NATO Joint Command in Brussels, a very different kind of mathematics was taking place. The command center was a cathedral of data. Massive digital screens displayed the tactical feeds from the Karkaroff Valley in real time. Satellite imagery, Infrared heat maps and electronic signal intercepts painted a comprehensive, terrifying picture of the impending engagement. High-ranking officials, analysts, and generals stood in silent clusters, watching the telemetry data stream across the screens. They were the experts. They were the men who wrote the doctrine that governed modern warfare. And the doctrine was telling them that Major Thomas Vance and his 40 men were already dead. The primary tactical AI, a highly classified predictive algorithm designed to simulate combat outcomes, had been crunching the numbers for the past hour. It factored in the terrain, the weather, the armaments of both forces, the ammunition reserves, and the psychological profiles of the combatants. The algorithm displayed a single glowing percentage on the central screen, 99.8%. That was the probability of total force destruction for the SAS detachment. The algorithm had concluded that the defenders could not generate enough kinetic output to halt the mass of Arasov's 400 mercenaries. It predicted that the defensive perimeter would collapse within 45 minutes of the initial assault, followed by a systematic slaughter of the surviving operators. Lieutenant General James Sterling, the commanding officer of Joint Special Operations, stared at the percentage. He was a veteran of conventional warfare, a man who believed in the safety of numbers and the security of overwhelming air support. But a severe winter storm cell had grounded all Allied aircraft in the region. There would be no fast air response. There would be no attack helicopters. Vance was entirely isolated. Sterling keyed the secure satellite uplink to the Archangel node. "Echo Actual, this is command," Sterling said, his voice tight with the strain of impending disaster. "We are tracking 400 hostile effectives staging at your northern perimeter. Our predictive models indicate a 0% probability of holding the facility. You are ordered to initiate Protocol Scorch. Destroy the data drives, collapse the subterranean access shafts, and initiate immediate exfiltration via the southern ridge. Do you copy?" In the valley, Vance stood in the shadows of a rocky outcropping, the freezing wind tearing at his uniform. He pressed the transmit button on his headset. "Command, Echo Actual. Negative on Protocol Scorch. The southern ridge is exposed to thermal surveillance. Exfiltration would result in a prolonged running gun battle over open terrain. We would be neutralized within 2 miles. Sterling gripped the edge of his console. "Vance, you have 40 men. You cannot hold a valley against a mechanized battalion. It is statistically impossible. I'm giving you a direct order to withdraw." "General," Vance replied, his tone unchanged, "statistics are based on the assumption of equal tactical application. The enemy has mass. We have geometry. We are not leaving the facility. You will be overrun in an hour, Major." "Negative, Command," Vance said. "The enemy force is heavily mechanized. The valley floor is composed of unstable shale and glacial till. Their armor cannot advance beyond the first choke point without risking track shedding or structural subsidence. They will be forced to dismount. Once they dismount, they are infantry. Once they are infantry, they must adhere to the physical dimensions of the valley." There was a silence on the line. In Brussels, the analysts looked at each other, rapidly pulling up geological surveys of the valley floor. "General," Vance continued, "I have not prepared a defense. I have prepared a sequence. The numbers on your screen are irrelevant. Tell the algorithm to factor in the coefficient of friction." Vance cut the transmission. In Brussels, General Sterling stared at the dead radio channel. He looked back at the predictive algorithm. It still read 99.8%. But Sterling, despite his reliance on data, recognized something in Vance's voice. It was the sound of a man who had already seen the end of the battle. Vance was not hoping to survive. He had already calculated his survival as an absolute certainty. Sterling turned to his chief analyst. "Record everything," he ordered quietly. "Every radio transmission, every thermal bloom, every biometric spike. If Vance is right, he is about to rewrite the manual on asymmetric defense. To comprehend the sequence that Vance had engineered, one must examine the topography of the Karkaroff Valley through the eyes of a predator. The valley was shaped like an hourglass. The northern entrance, where Arisov's forces were staged, was relatively wide, allowing for the deployment of multiple vehicles side by side. But as one moved south, deeper into the valley, the granite walls converged sharply. 300 yards from the entrance, the valley narrowed to a width of just 50 yards. This was the throat of the hourglass. It was flanked on both sides by sheer cliff faces that rose 200 feet into the air. There was no way around it. To reach the Archangel node, Arisov's forces had to pass through this exact space. This was Vance's primary killbox. He designated it Sector Alpha. But Vance knew that simply shooting at the enemy as they entered Sector Alpha was not enough. 400 men, even restricted by the terrain, could still lay down a volume of suppressive fire that would obliterate any visible defensive positions. Therefore, Vance did not build visible defensive positions. He deployed his 40 men in 3 distinct tiers, utilizing the verticality of the cliff faces. Tier 1 consisted of the observers and the snipers. They were positioned near the top of the cliffs, hidden within deep crevices and masked by thermal blankets that completely masked their body heat from Arisov's sensors. They were armed with L115A3 long-range rifles, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. Their objective was not to inflict mass casualties. Their objective was decapitation. They were mathematically assigned specific targets: radio operators, squad leaders, heavy weapons specialists. Tier 2 was the kinetic wall. Halfway down the cliff faces, Vance had positioned his heavy gunners. They manned L7A2 general-purpose machine guns. But they were not positioned to fire directly at the enemy. Firing directly exposes the muzzle flash and makes the gunner a target. Instead, Vance had positioned the machine guns to fire in an enfilade, an intersecting crossfire that swept horizontally across the width of the valley. Any enemy entering Sector Alpha would not be shot from the front. They would be shredded from the sides. Tier 3 was the variable. It was the valley floor itself. Over the previous 72 hours, Vance's structural engineers had painstakingly mapped the 50-yard stretch of Sector Alpha. They had planted precisely 62 M18A1 Claymore mines. But they did not plant them randomly. They planted them according to the mathematical principles of explosive overpressure. When a Claymore detonates, it fires 700 steel ball bearings in a 60-degree arc. Vance's engineers aligned the arcs so that they perfectly overlapped, creating a continuous, unbroken sheet of flying steel that covered every square inch of the choke point from knee to chest height. They did not use tripwires. Tripwires can be spotted. They did not use remote detonators. Remote detonators can be jammed by electronic warfare. Instead, they wired the explosives into a closed-circuit, hardwired command detonation grid. The firing mechanism was a simple, mechanical plunger located in Vance's command bunker, buried deep within the rock. It was impervious to hacking. It was immune to jamming. It was a perfect closed system. Vance sat in the darkness of his bunker, a small reinforced concrete pillbox overlooking Sector Alpha. A single low-light monitor displayed the feed from a concealed camera at the mouth of the valley. Beside him sat Sergeant Miller, his second-in-command. Miller was calmly checking the action on his rifle. His heart rate, monitored by a biometric sensor on his wrist, was resting at a steady 65 beats per minute. "They're moving," Miller said quietly, his eyes on the monitor. On the screen, the thermal outlines of Arisov's armored vehicles began to inch forward. The massive diesel engines roared, sending plumes of hot exhaust into the freezing air. Behind the vehicles, the infantry advanced in textbook, staggered columns. They looked unstoppable. They looked like a machine of absolute destruction. Vance did not blink. He looked at the chronometer on his wrist. It read 0442 hours. "Let them enter the funnel," Vance commanded. "Nobody fires until they reach the primary demarcation line. We do not engage the armor. We wait for the friction." The slow burn of logic had reached its ignition point. The mathematics were about to be tested. At 0448 hours, the lead elements of Arisov's armored column crossed the threshold of the Karkaroff Valley. 3 BTR-80 armored personnel carriers, their 30mm cannons sweeping the dark ridges above, rumbled forward. The sound of their engines was deafening, echoing off the granite walls and masking the subtle, crunching footsteps of the 200 infantrymen, following closely behind in the first assault wave. Arisov sat in the command vehicle, monitoring the thermal feeds. The screens remained black. No heat signatures. No movement. "Keep advancing," Arisov ordered over the encrypted net. "They are hiding deep in the rocks. Maintain suppressive posture. If you see a shadow, put a high explosive round into it." The column moved deeper into the hourglass. 200 yards. 250 yards. They were approaching Sector Alpha. The valley walls began to close in, forcing the 3 BTR-80s to shift from a side-by-side formation into a single file line. The infantry, previously spread out in a wide tactical advance, were forced to compress, bunching up as the navigable terrain shrank from 100 yards wide down to 60, then 50. This was the exact moment the physics of the valley asserted themselves. As Vance had predicted to General Sterling, the valley floor was not solid rock. It was composed of unstable shale and glacial till, loose, shifting debris that had accumulated over millennia. The lead BTR-80, weighing over 13 tons, hit a patch of deep till. Its 8 massive tires spun, digging rapidly into the loose shale. The driver panicked and applied more throttle. The vehicle lurched, sliding sideways, its heavy armored hull sinking down to the axles. "Lead vehicle immobilized," the driver reported over the radio, his voice strained. "We are stuck in the shale." Arisov frowned. "Vehicle 2, bypass and take the lead. Vehicle 1, dismount your infantry." The second BTR-80 attempted to maneuver around the stuck lead vehicle, but the valley was now only 50 yards wide. To pass, the second vehicle had to drive dangerously close to the western cliff face. As it did, its right side tires struck a jagged, concealed outcropping of solid granite. There was a sickening metallic screech as the suspension snapped. The vehicle tilted violently, its heavy turret slamming against the rock wall, effectively wedging it in place. Within 90 seconds of entering the choke point, Arisov's armored advantage had been entirely neutralized by the geography. The two massive vehicles now formed a steel roadblock, completely blocking the path for the rest of the convoy. "All vehicles halt," Arisov barked. "Dismount all infantry. We proceed on foot. Push through the gap." This was the fatal command. This was the moment Arisov abandoned his mechanical advantage and submitted his men to Vance's algorithm. 200 mercenaries poured out from behind the stalled vehicles. They were well-trained, heavily armed, and aggressive. They surged forward, squeezing through the narrow gaps between the stuck BTRs and the cliff walls, eager to break out into the open space beyond. They flooded into Sector Alpha. In his bunker, Vance watched the thermal monitor. The screen, previously black, was now blindingly bright with the heat signatures of 200 men packed tightly into a space meant for 20. They were not a tactical formation anymore. They were a dense, biological mass. "Tier 1, Vance said calmly into his microphone. "Execute." High above, hidden in the freezing crevices of the cliffs, the suppressed L115 A3 sniper rifles coughed. The sound was negligible, swallowed instantly by the roaring diesel engines of the stuck vehicles below. The snipers did not shoot the men in the front. They shot the men in the middle and the rear of the formation. They targeted the mercenaries carrying the heavy radios, the men with the squad leader insignias, the men carrying the portable mortar tubes. Down in the valley, men simply folded in half and dropped. There was no chaotic barrage. There was no cinematic hail of gunfire. There was just the clinical, rhythmic removal of command and control. The mercenary formation fractured. Men scrambled for cover that didn't exist, eyes darting toward the silent ridges as their comrades collapsed into the shale. They only saw their officers collapsing silently into the shale. Sniper fire, elevated positions. A surviving squad leader screamed into his radio. Return fire. Sweep the ridges. The mercenaries raised their rifles and began firing blindly at the top of the cliffs. Tracers lit up the night sky, hundreds of rounds shattering harmlessly against the solid granite face, 50 feet below the actual sniper positions. They were wasting ammunition on shadows. Tier 2, Vance commanded. Crossfire. Halfway down the cliffs, the L7A2 general-purpose machine guns opened up. Because they were positioned to fire horizontally across the valley rather than straight down, the mercenaries had no cover. The steel husks of the stuck BTRs protected them from the front, but the machine gun fire was coming from the sides. The heavy 7.62 millimeter rounds tore through the dense formation like a scythe through wheat. The intersecting fields of fire created a geometric web of destruction. If a mercenary dove to the left to avoid the fire from the eastern cliff, he placed himself directly in the path of the fire from the western cliff. The 50-yard gap became an impossible geometry of intersecting ballistics. The mercenaries, trapped between the sheer walls, the stalled vehicles behind them, and the wall of lead cutting across their flanks, did exactly what human beings do when subjected to overwhelming kinetic pressure. They stopped moving forward. They compressed. They huddled together, seeking safety in proximity, completely forgetting their training. They formed a single, massive, terrified cluster in the dead center of Sector Alpha. Vance watched the monitor. His face was a mask of utter detachment. He did not feel pity. He did not feel triumph. He watched the thermal cluster until it reached maximum density. He reached out and placed his hand on the mechanical plunger. "Algorithm complete," Vance whispered. He pushed the plunger down. The detonation of 62 perfectly aligned M18A1 Claymore mines in a confined acoustic space does not sound like an explosion. It sounds like the sky tearing open. The command detonation grid performed flawlessly. All 62 mines fired simultaneously. 43,400 steel ball bearings, propelled by high explosives, traveling at roughly 4,000 feet per second, swept across the valley floor at knee-to-chest height. The intersecting arcs of shrapnel left no gaps. There was no dead space. There was no micro-terrain to hide behind. It was a mathematical absolute. The thermal monitor in Vance's bunker flared a brilliant white. The camera lens instantly blinded by the flash of the explosives before cutting to static as the shockwave pulverized the recording equipment. The physical shockwave hit the cliff faces, rebounded, and hit the center of the valley again, creating a localized overpressure event that shattered the reinforced glass of the stuck armored vehicles. The sound wave alone was enough to rupture the eardrums of any man within 200 yards. Then, absolute silence descended on the Karkaroff Valley. The roaring diesel engines of the BTRs had stalled. The frantic radio chatter had ceased. The blind, suppressive gunfire had stopped. The silence was heavier than the noise. In Brussels, General Sterling and his analysts stared at the massive digital screens. The predictive algorithm, which had hovered at 99.8% probability of SAS destruction for the past hour, suddenly glitched. The red dots representing the first wave of 200 hostile effectives simply vanished from the satellite telemetry. They did not retreat. They did not disperse. They ceased to exist as active data points. "Status," Sterling demanded, his voice barely a whisper in the stunned command center. "Give me a status on the valley floor." An analyst, her fingers trembling over her keyboard, brought up the high-resolution infrared scan. "General," she stammered, the hostile mass in Sector Alpha is no longer emitting active kinetic signatures. The thermal blooms are fading. They are neutralized." Sterling stared at the screen. 200 men, half of Arisov's entire force, erased in exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. At the northern entrance of the valley, Viktor Arisov sat in his command vehicle, staring at his tactical display. His radio net was a graveyard of dead static. He had just lost 200 men, his lead armor, and all of his forward momentum. He had not seen a single enemy soldier. Arisov was a man of logistics. He understood attrition, but he was looking at a ledger that had just been violently zeroed out. He keyed his microphone, switching back to the open, unencrypted frequency. His voice, previously calm and authoritative, now carried the distinct, brittle edge of a man whose reality had fractured. "Vance," Arisov transmitted. "What was that? What did you use?" In the bunker, Vance did not immediately respond. He turned to Sergeant Miller. "Casualty report," Vance said. "0 casualties, sir," Miller replied, checking the biometric feeds of the 40 men. "Ammunition expenditure across the detachment is currently at 4.6%. Primary defensive line remains entirely uncompromised." Vance nodded. He pressed the transmit button on his headset. "Arisov," Vance said, his voice echoing over the radio exactly as it had an hour prior. Cold, clinical, unbothered. That was the mathematics of a choke point. You have lost 50% of your effectives. You have lost your mechanized mobility. My detachment has expended less than 5% of its operational capacity." There was a long pause on the radio. "You are 40 men," Arisov said, almost as if trying to convince himself. "You cannot hold this indefinitely. I still have 200 men in reserve. I will bring up the heavy mortars. I will level the cliffs." "Negative," Vance replied. "You will not deploy mortars. Your forward observers were neutralized by Tier 1 snipers during the initial advance. You have no line of sight to plot artillery coordinates. If you fire blind into a valley of this depth, the trajectory arcs dictate that 50% of your ordnance will strike the cliff faces and airburst over your own staging area." Vance paused, letting the logistical truth settle into Arisov's mind. "Your assault has culminated, Arisov. Your numerical advantage is mathematically void. If you send your remaining 200 men into the valley, they will encounter the exact same geometric constraints. The outcome will be identical. The timeline will simply reset." Arisov sat in his command vehicle. He looked at the massive, dark jaws of the valley. He looked at the bodies of his remaining men, huddled behind the vehicles, their eyes wide with the sudden, paralyzing realization that they were not the predators in this environment. They were the variables in an equation they did not understand. Arisov was a rational actor. He did not fight for glory. He fought for profit. And the calculus of profit dictates that you do not invest resources into a failing asset. "Withdraw," Arisov ordered quietly to his driver. "Sir?" "I said withdraw the column. Put the vehicles in reverse. We are abandoning the objective." In Brussels, the satellite feeds showed the impossible. The remaining armored vehicles of the mercenary convoy were slowly backing away from the Karkaroff Valley, their engines whining as they retreated into the darkness. General Sterling exhaled a breath that had been trapped in his chest for an hour. He looked up at the predictive algorithm on the central screen. The 99.8% probability of destruction had vanished. In its place, the system simply displayed threat neutralized, assets secure. The true nature of the engagement at the Karkaroff Valley was immediately classified at the highest levels of NATO intelligence. The official reports stated that a hostile mercenary force had encountered severe logistical difficulties and retreated due to adverse weather conditions. The public never learned about the Archangel node. They never learned about the 400 heavily armed men who tried to seize it. And they never learned about the 40 men who stopped them. 2 weeks after the incident, Major Thomas Vance sat in a sterile briefing room in London. Across the table sat a panel of senior intelligence officers and logistical analysts. They had spent days reviewing the telemetry, the audio intercepts, and the blast patterns on the valley floor. They were struggling to comprehend how a 10-to-1 numerical disadvantage had been completely inverted without a single Allied casualty. Major Vance, a senior analyst, began, adjusting his glasses. "We have reviewed your tactical layout. The overlapping arcs of the machine guns, the precise placement of the explosives. It is highly irregular. Standard doctrine dictates a defense-in-depth strategy, allowing the enemy to penetrate and absorbing their momentum." "Standard doctrine is designed for standard terrain," Vance replied, his voice flat, his posture perfectly still. "The Karkaroff Valley is not standard terrain. It is a closed system. Defense in depth requires space to trade for time. I had no space. Therefore, I traded geometry for mass." The analyst frowned, looking down at his notes. "But the psychological aspect, Major. You allowed a heavily mechanized force to advance within 50 yards of your primary position without initiating contact. The stress levels, the risk of your men breaking discipline." "There was no risk of broken discipline," Vance interrupted softly. "How can you be certain?" the analyst pressed. 400 men bearing down on you. It is human nature to panic." "I did not deploy human nature," Vance said, his eyes locking onto the analyst with the cold, unblinking intensity of a machine. "I deployed professionals. We do not operate on emotion. Emotion is a variable that introduces friction. Friction introduces failure." Vance leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. The enemy commander believed that because he had 10 times the men, he possessed 10 times the lethal capacity. He failed to understand that lethal capacity is not measured by the number of rifles you bring to a battlefield. It is measured by the number of rifles you can effectively employ within a specific physical space. Vance tapped a single finger on the table, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. 400 men trying to fit through a 50-yard gap are not an army. They are a target. The mathematics were always on our side. Arasov just couldn't see the equation until we solved it for him. The panel sat in silence. There was nothing left to question. There was no luck to analyze, no heroic anomaly to explain away. It was simply the brutal, uncompromising triumph of extreme competence over overwhelming